Hey Meissner makers, it is Wednesday, it's 1 o'clock, and we know what that means. Wednesday workshop at 1. I'm Jennifer, and Jody is here with me today, and what we want to take you through is what I think a really fantastic, easy, very complex looking project that is perfect for summertime embroidery, or really, as you're going to see with Jody's sample, any time of the year embroidery, to include special holiday specific projects. So what we're going to look at today is this Hexagon quilt by Sweet Pea Embroidery Designs, and it's created entirely in the, well, almost entirely in the hoop. There's some construction to follow at the end. So Jody, do you want to hold the table runner up here so we can have a look? Our friends at home. So you can see all of the hexagon shapes here with their fill-in diamonds. And Jody has done hers for, well, year-round at Jody's house, but for some of us, it would be a Halloween table runner. In using this technique, you're also able to do some fussy cutting of your fabrics, right, is what you had mentioned.
Yes.
So there are two different styles of blocks. There's the full hexie, and then there's the pieced hexie. And this is really nothing more than embroidered applique done over a piece of batting. So the products that we need, we'll talk about those first, and then we'll just jump right to the machine and stitch a block out, because I think that's the most exciting part of this. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about how to stitch each of the blocks together, so there is a little bit of sewing, and also some things to be thinking about for fabric selection, fabric layout, and then I'll show you a variation using these same blocks. So what did you use for stabilizer, Jody?
I used no-show mesh, and I prepped it by steaming it so that it shrunk up, And
now, did you use your press to do that?
I did.
All right.
I did, because I was doing so many. I just laid a big piece down and pressed it all at once, and then I hooped it. So I actually had two machines going doing this, because I threw Jennifer. This was a challenge that I threw down for Jennifer, and she kicked my fanny on this.
You'll see the other variations.
Yes, and she was like way ahead of me. So, so I was running two. I was running two machines to catch up.
So the other choice for stabilizer, and when I started mine, I also used no-show mesh. By the way, no-show mesh is now known as Power Mesh. It's just a different packaging, different branding. It's the same poly mesh stabilizer that you know and love from our friends at Floriani and R&K. I would not recommend tearaway for this particular project. There's a lot of heavy stitching, stippling over some of these blocks, and it would not be a lot of fun to pick that back out if you were using a tearaway. So I would avoid that.
And the back construction gets really
it'll get really difficult in there. However, I did not happen to have a roll of this at home, and now I'm very sorry. Wet and Gone stabilizer. It has the same hand and the same texture as your Power Mesh stabilizer, but it'll totally rinse away. So if I had been pre-planning versus simply racing with Jody, I probably would have waited and started after I'd had a chance to pick up some Wet and Gone stabilizer.
And I had some at home, and I wished I hadn't even thought of that. And it did not even cross my mind then to do that.
It'll just keep it a little softer. All right, so we need some batting, we need some fabric, and we need to load our design on the machine, and then we're ready to stitch the three-colored block.
Yes.
All right, are we ready to stitch, Jody?
Yes, we are.
All right, let's move around to the machine.
So the first stitch that is going to happen on this design is we're going to have a placement. And we are going to take our batting and we're going to center it in the middle of the hoop. Later on, I'm going to show you how to do multiple hoopings so that you're trying to do as many at one time on a hoop. That's why I'm on the Luminaire today. But for this, we're just going to do one single one. So I'm centered. I'm going to do my first stitch out, which is going to tack this down. Now in the instructions you get a choice of trimming your batting now or trimming it later on. Now I like to trim it out now because it puts less bulk in the seam, and actually once we start doing some of the other stitching, it's a little bit wider. It's like 1 to 2 millimeters wider, so this will not have as much bulk in the seam. So I'm going to trim this first. And I'm using the applique scissors out of this kit. And you want to trim it up as close as you can. And I'm actually using Pellon 988 because I didn't have a whole bunch of batting at home. So, okay, so I have trimmed it, I've put it back on the machine, and we are now going to stitch our first placement line for our fabric. Okay, so another thing that's a little bit different when you're doing these blocks is you want to make sure that you have a lot of fabric hanging out to the left, right, north, south, east, and west, because we want to be able to leave a 1/2 inch at least minimum around the outside for a later seam allowance. So don't be stingy with your fabric on this. Just go ahead and lay it down. Okay, so I'm going to place my fabric down. I'm going to tape it down so that it won't move when I'm sewing it. Make sure again that you have at least a 1/2 inch. It's better to have an inch and cut away. And now it is going to tack down my fabric. Now what's interesting about this design is it does a complete block stitch up. So you will complete this part of the block first before we go on to the second part of this block. So you're going to remove your tape and save it for your next one. And I know my section here and my section here needs to be long. So I'm just going to trim along this part of the design. And I want to have way more than I need, and then that way I don't have to worry about running out of fabric. It is now going to stitch out the decorative design on top. These blocks are pretty fast. The smaller ones are like only about 5 minutes. Okay, so we have actually completed the first third of our block. So now I'm going to do my second placement line. Now, if I was at home and I had all my threads, I would be changing out my threads to probably purple about now or whatever, but for the sake of this video, we're just kind of doing that a little bit. We're doing a little cheater here. So again, on my outside, I want to make sure that I have plenty of fabric right over here. I know this is going to be into a seam, and I know this is going to be into a seam. So I'm just going to go ahead and put down my second color, and this is my tack down. And I'm going to tape it in place. going to remove my tape, and now I need to move my hoop. And I'm going to trim here, and I'm going to trim along there. And I'm going to leave everything else long. And now I am going to do my decorative stitch for the center of my block. Purple on yellow would be really nice. But if you're not doing Halloween, that just happens to be kind of my favorite fabric. Now this block has one extra stitch to it. It is now going to do a satin stitch between these two right here to cover up that seam right there. These blocks stitch really, really fast. Of course, I don't know about the bigger ones, but these 4-inch ones are really, really fast. But remember, when the smaller the blocks are, the more you need to complete your project. And I obviously was not thinking that ahead. So, and I really didn't know how many blocks. I was making it up as I was going. So I kept stitching more and stitching more and stitching more. And eventually I said, you know what? I'm going to add 3.5-inch border, and it's big enough. I had stitched enough. Okay, we have our last third. And now that is going to do our placement line. Again, we need to make sure we have at least a 1/2 inch over here and over here. So I'm going to make sure I have plenty of fabric. And now it's going to do my tack down. I'm going to tape it in place. Remove the hoop and trim on the inside of the stitch out only, leaving the outside border at least a 1/2 inch wide. The next stitch is going to be our decorative stitch in the center of the diamond. I found I got good at doing meandering stitching for a quilt. That was pretty easy. Okay, the last stitch of this block is going to be a satin stitch. That's going to go from here to here to finish off that edge. On some of mine I did the same, and then some of them I changed up the color. So it's kind of personal preference. Okay, so we're going to finish off the stitching, the satin stitching. You know, I got an extra block here now. I'm going to probably have to put it with a couple of the extra blocks I have at home. So maybe I'll make like a little small candle mat now. I could put the black flame candle on it. Needle came out. Okay, block is done. Now it's ready to be trimmed.
Jody, you are very adamant about leaving a lot of fabric around the outside of that edge. Why was that?
Well, because if you accidentally cut it too short, it is a lot harder to put in the seams and line it up. So you have a little bit more wiggle room with a 1/2 inch. And it also helps you do a 1/2 inch seam allowance, because on some of these other pieces, you don't have the the luxury of having a 1/2 inch.
Okay.
It's a 1/4 inch. So you kind of want to make sure that you have that. And even though there's a gap here, it doesn't really matter because it will be taken up into the seam right up to here. So now I'm going to trim a 1/2 inch all the way around. So now you can see why it's so important to have that extra fabric hanging around. And there is my block all trimmed up.
So now from there, we would stitch out however many blocks we feel like we need for the project. And as we mentioned earlier, there's the 3-piece block, which is what Jody stitched out. And then there are what I would call the solid blocks that are just filled with background stipple. It is up to you how many of each type of block, but I would suggest doing all your 3-piece blocks first, because it seems like it just snowballs and goes that much faster afterwards, because these solidy blocks stitch up really fast. You don't have to do the trimming and the laying down of additional fabrics. Now, when we get ready, and we're going to show you in just a minute, when you're ready to assemble your piece, you're going to be creating this unit. Now, it might be longer than this, depending on how big you want your piece to be. So as you're getting ready to join the segments together, it's important that you keep your hexie flat side up, okay? And then we're going to show you in just a minute how to join these. Now, if you're piecing in a way that's similar to what they show in the directions, the part about the flat side being an up or a down is going to be important if you're working with a fabric that has a definite up, down, or stripe to it. This fabric that I used in my quilt, I would have been a little disturbed if it were sitting at an angle or sitting upside down. It has a definite right way to be positioned. Now, if this is something that's going to apply to your quilt, then for your project, definitely be thinking about that ahead of time. So with Jody's segments here that she's joining, you've got flat, 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 and all the points are going right, either horizontally or vertically. If you'll hold that for just a minute so I can point out. When I join mine together, they're joined a little bit differently, right? So I still have the flat being an up or a down. So this is where it was so important to make sure that, the text in my fabric was going the right way. Okay, we'll talk more about the variation once we get through the as written in the instructions. So what do we do next, Jody?
Okay, so then you're going to go ahead and you're going to stitch out all of your solid pieces, and then all of, or however many of these half hexies. Is that what those are called?
Half hexies.
Half hexies. Okay, so this is the first time I've ever done a hexie quilt ever. So I was kind of proud that after I kind of figured it out. So now we're going to start assembling it. So on this block over here, what kind of kept me on track, to me this was always the top.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my designated one block that was always the top. So on all of these little diamonds, to start assembling this, I'm going to take and add this to this. And I was going to, you line up your stitching, you do your 1/2 inch, and on the block that doesn't have the designated diamond on top, you put one to the diamond to the side, and on the melanderines,
Across the way?
yeah, directly across, you assemble the other, you add on the other one. So you have the top and the bottom have no diamonds added to them whatsoever. And it's kind of, how I kept it straight in my mind was the side.
Yep.
That's how it worked for me.
Yep.
Okay.
Now, Jody's mentioning 1/2 inch seam allowances. It depends how you trimmed. What you're really doing is you're joining the stitching line from the triangle to the stitching line on the hexie.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And that's why to me, it was really important to keep that 1/2 inch.
Yep.
But what I did was I lined up a pin here and a pin here, and then I peeked and went, oh yeah, they're lining up, and then I pinned it, and I'm good. And 99 out of most of it worked. It worked on that one. And then on this one, it was really easy. They just kind of go across from each other. So you would put one here and one over here. You would line them up. You would stitch them down. And there was that one.
So that's your segment here and your segment here.
And on the bottom 1/2 hex, it was, if you look at it, you turn them both the same. It was always to the left. So that was really easy. And eventually you flip one and you build in between.
Here's your section, right? And then we join it to this piece that we've stitched, which is here. And then we join it to this section, which is here. And then our last 1/2 hexie
What's up there?
triangle, which is here. Now, as you're stitching these together, I did a little pressing as I went using, just a small iron right there at my board. When I'm done, because you are going to find this has a little bit of thickness to it, I would take it to the press and give it a good press to set everything down, right? You've got some thickness here. Also, these seam allowances are pressed open as opposed to pressing from one side to the other, again, because of the bulk. But something else I'm noticing in yours, because I cut everything 1/4 inch, having that quilter mentality, the 1/2 inch actually sits flatter than the 1/4 inch does. So if I were doing this again, I would totally go to that 1/2 inch size. It was really, could be a little bit of a struggle to get it nice and flat in this section. So I think that's a great way to do it.
And when you're sewing the seam here and here, it made it a lot easier to have something. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of why I was stressing that the whole 1/2 inch thing right there.
Yeah. Totally the way to do it.
Yeah.
All right. So
I love how yours turns out.
basically, so here's the variation. So when she threw down that gauntlet, I'm like, what are we going to do? So here's where I ended up. Oh, we're even holding it right side up. And so honestly, the way that I built this was I stitched out a few test blocks, and then I just started shuffling them around on my cutting table until I liked the way that they looked. So if you're familiar with the hexie, and even if you're not, I would suggest going to Pinterest and checking out, do a search for hexie. You can always lay them out, one touching the next, right? And have no triangles on the in-between. So you'd have another one here, and another one here, and another one here, right? How they just fit all the way around, like a grandmother's garden, would be another way to lay them out. You could lay them out so that the points are up and then you have all flat sides joining this way, and you would have your triangles dipping down, so it makes like a little bit of a chevron pattern going across.
Yeah.
I liked this because I didn't have to make quite as many, to be honest, hexies, as I might to finish the whole quilt. And then in order to create the 60-degree diamonds here in the middle, once you join these segments, and my very fancy way of joining the segments was I laid it out on the cutting table, one of them, and I'm like, okay, is this the right way? Does it work? And then I stacked them on top and stacked them on top and then just did one of the diamonds at a time.
I love this idea that you
Isn't
went
that
into,
fun?
yeah, I mean, it just opened it up.
But once this diamond is stitched, it still has seam allowances, right? So if you take that diamond and put it on a piece of tearaway stabilizer to make yourself a pattern for your other diamonds is exactly how I did it. So that's kind of where we are. The other question you might be asking yourself, what about the batting? Okay, Jody was really good. She cut her batting, positioned it in her hoop, and it was centered, blah, blah, blah. I played with batting scraps. I had a lot of them. So if you're doing the batting scrap method, I'm giving you 2 tips here. You're going to need to stitch the batting placement line, put your scrap batting down, and then you're going to have to back up and stitch that row again. If that to you was completely foreign and made your heart rate go up a little bit, then use Jody's method. If you were like, oh yeah, I've been embroidering for 100 years like Jennifer, use the scrap batting method. So there is batting behind the diamonds. There is no batting behind these diamonds. It's not a big deal. I'm going to put the whole thing to bat. I'm going to stitch in the ditch around these diamonds and call that good, and then play with some fancy pants quilting in this area.
And another thing too is with so much stitching on it, it almost flattens it, so you can easily get away with more batting behind it, so it doesn't really matter.
So
Very
that's
pretty.
where we are with this version.
So this is what got me going when she sent me a picture of what she had done, and I went, uh-oh.
I gotta get stitching.
I start speeding up on this challenge because I'm just a little behind.
That's all right. I'm addicted now. I'm going to do it again, and I hope that all of you will be as excited about the variations with these blocks as we are. Telling you, Pinterest, Hexies, you're going to find all sorts of amazing ways to lay this piece out. So again, if you're looking for the design collection, it's from Sweet Pea. You can find them online. I think it's just www.sweetpea.com.
SW. SWP.com, yeah.
And you will find this collection lives there. If you have questions about anything else that we showed today, if you want to send us pictures of your Hexie project in process, we would love to hear from you. Info, INFO, @meissnersewing.com, and we'll see you next week.